A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. Well, as those of you that have been with us know that we are going through my book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety, and that we've addressed the first 3 insights so far. The first one being, that waking up from our sleepwalking. And it's very important in our lives that we answer that alarm when it goes off instead of continuing to hit snooze, as many of us do. We don't want to wake up. We don't want to wake up. It's something happens, and oftentimes it's the pain, right? We encounter a really painful experience in our life that we just can't ignore anymore, or like you guys have seen with me, some trauma starts to come forward, and there's no way I can ignore it. It's breaking through my skin and it's hurting like I'm hurting like hell. And so now we start to wake up and we start to look at this stuff. And as we wake up, we start to now live life much more consciously. And that becomes a very important requirement for emotional sobriety, is bringing, even if it's just 5% more consciousness to our daily lives. We start to put on a new pair of glasses. And as we start to look at our lives through these new lenses that we've kind of ground in doing the emotional sobriety work, we start seeing things that we didn't see before. And one of the things that we see as we focus on what's going on in our life is the extent to which that we are governed by this emotional dependency. The degree that it controls our life is mind-boggling at times, at how powerful it is. It creates this other validated self-esteem that I'm okay if you like me. I'm okay if you talk to me in a certain way. I'm okay if you do what I want you to do. So that emotional dependency generates so many expectations that then get converted into these unenforceable rules on how things are supposed to be. And I throw these rules out all over the place. Virginia Satir, a brilliant family therapist, said that in our society that we impose on marriage all of these ideas about how love is supposed to be. Things like, if you loved me, you wouldn't want to do anything without me. If you loved me, you'd agree with me all the time. If you loved me, you'd know what I want before I even have to ask you. I mean, that's how crazy we get with this thing. And then if somebody doesn't do that, we either get mad at them and blame them, or we get mad at ourselves and blame ourselves, or we just withdraw from the relationship and stonewall the person. So using our consciousness to become aware and discerning our emotional dependency becomes very important. Once again, we've talked about acceptance as being a prerequisite to change. And so accepting that I'm emotionally dependent and that this thing is governing me becomes the beginning of breaking the chains of that emotional dependency. It's the sledgehammer I use to bust those chains loose, right, from my shackles. So as we start to discern this, and as we realize how our life has been riddled with this emotional dependency and how much it's influenced our behavior and how we look at our relationships. We are on the verge, right, of developing a whole new consciousness. You cannot solve a problem with the consciousness that created it. You've heard that quote said many times by me, by her, by other people, that somehow we have to transcend this consciousness that was really based on looking at the world through this lens of emotional dependency and develop a consciousness that's based on a true independence of spirit, that's based on emotional freedom, that's based on emotional autonomy, that's based on having an honest relationship and an appropriate relationship with reality. And that's what we're starting to do when we see our emotional dependence. We realize how inappropriate and how dishonest we've been. The inappropriate is expecting other people to do whatever we want them to do so we feel better. We make other people, for in one crazy way, so important that we need them to be, what we need them to be, but we make them unimportant because we don't care about what they need. We just care about what they're going to do for us. So it's such a crazy thing, making somebody so important and at the same time making them unimportant. Something is always something else at the same time. That's what it is. So as we're discerning this, as we're becoming aware, as we learn to take that emotional sobriety inventory, as I talked about last time, and starting to unravel our disturbance when we're disturbed, Bill said it very clearly in step 10, that it's a spiritual axiom that every time I am disturbed, there's something, he says, wrong with us. I like to say there's something off with us. And what's off with us is there's an expectation and a dependency. And our job is to continue to try to uncover and discover those things so we can start to become aware of how powerful and how much governance they have in our life. Rollo May said something very interesting. He says, one does not become free by denying the extent to which his behavior is being determined by these forces. One becomes free by understanding and owning how determined he or she is. Once again, it's the paradoxical theory of change. So now that we're discerning our emotional sobriety, we need to start looking at what ways does that dependence manifest itself. And so when I'm dependent on you, then what that means is I make everything about me. And so when you behave this way or that way, and especially if you do something that bothers me, I take it very personal, like you're doing that to me. And so our emotional dependency fuses us with another person or with a lot of different people in our life. There's an emotional fusion that takes place. And out of that fusion comes this taking things personally. I believe you're saying and you're doing what you're doing because of how you feel about me. Not because of who you are, but because of how you feel about me. You see, I make everything about me. Now, it's appropriate when we were kids to do that. Everything was about us. And it's understandably so. We talk about every child being egocentric, and they are. That consciousness hasn't developed. They haven't differentiated themselves. But many of us are stuck in that stage of development. We never move out of it's all about me stage of development. We are stuck there. And that's why I say when we realize this stuff, it doesn't mean you're wrong. You're a bad person. You should be ashamed of yourself. This is terrible behavior. It just means you're stuck. We call it the stuck point in our life. Fritz Perls called it the sick point. It's that point where our pain and our suffering manifests itself. So As we become aware of the extent to which we start to take things personally, it starts to reveal an awful lot in terms of how we react in relationships and what goes on. So that's what we're going to be doing in this chapter. It's really unraveling this whole thing about not taking things personally. And we're going to do that tonight. We're going to start that, and we're going to continue this discussion over the next 4 weeks. But tonight, you're going to be my subject in an experiment. So let me pick somebody. All right. Let me find somebody in the room. All right. I'm going to take Beth. Beth has come into my laboratory, my psychological laboratory. She walks in, and I explained to her that I'm doing this study, and that, if she agrees to participate, I'm going to be taking her in these various movie theaters I've set up. And there's only one other person in the theater along with her and I. And we're going to sit behind this person. We're going to watch the film, and she's going to share with me what her reaction is to that film and what she sees in the film and what it means to her. So she agrees to do it. She signs this informed consent I have. And so I take her, Beth, and we walk into the first movie theater. And there's this woman that's sitting there about the same age as Beth right now. And we sit behind her. We can't see her face because Beth's job is not to look at this woman. The instructions I've given her, she has to pay attention to the movie screen. So as she's sitting there and watching the movie screen, I start to see all of these facial expressions that tells me she's really recognizing an awful lot about what's happening in this movie, like nodding her head and almost anticipating where it's going. And I say, "What's going on, Beth?" She goes, "I recognize everything that's happening in this film. Everything that's happened, what the people are going to say." And then she sees who the protagonist is, who's the main actress in this, and it's her. You see, this film is the narrative. It's the story that Beth has about her whole life. It's the narrative that she has. So she recognized everything in this story. It's all about her. This is the way that she's experienced her life. So after she says, "How'd you do that?" I say, "Come with me. Let's go to the next room." So we walk over to the next movie theater, and we sit behind this elderly woman. Once again, Beth doesn't know who this is. It's dark in the movie theater. All we know is that there's this woman, that she's elderly. And she starts looking at the screen again, right? On the screen this time are also many people that she recognizes. She knows these people. These people have been a part of her life. But it's something strange is starting to happen, is that the way that this person is experiencing this story is very different than the story she just had. And when she saw some of the same interactions she was having, it means something very different to this person. And this person understands it in a very, very different way. She then realizes that this is her mother. And what she's seeing is her mother's narrative about life and how different it is than her narrative. And the meaning that her mother has given to these things is very different than the meaning that she's given to some of the things. Some of the things she thought was positive, her mother thinks are negative. Some of the things she thought were negative, her mother thought were positive. It's like all turned around for her. But what she's realizing as she's seeing this is that her mother is experiencing her life as her mother is. She experienced her life as she is. So I say, "Time to go to the next movie theater." We walk into the next one. The room's dark again, and there's this older gentleman sitting there. And we sit behind him, and the same thing starts to happen. she starts to recognize these people. But what's happening is once again, the narrative, the story that this person is telling himself is so different than hers, even though these are the same characters that appear in her story. And we go through the same thing, and she realizes this is her father. If Beth has a partner, we do it with her partner and realizes the same thing. That every person is experiencing their life in the way that they see their life. They're not experiencing it as we see it. When we make everything about us, we're operating from the idea that this person is living our story and not their story. We take what they're doing very personally, as though what they're doing is about us, not realizing that they're living their own story. They're not living our story. This is not about us. This is about them. Even if what they're saying is about us, it's not about us. It's about how they're reacting to us. It's based on their story and what that means to them. And for the first time in Beth's life, she starts to realize that all of these things that she's taken very personally were not personal at all. That was the goal of the experiment, to realize that every one of us is living their own story or in their own dream. And that when I believe that what you're doing is what I think you're doing to me, I have lost sight of that person completely. And we're going to learn as we go through these next several weeks is that one way of starting to break this pattern, this very unhealthy pattern of making everything about us, is to become aware of what this is telling us about the other person, rather than saying, what is this saying about how they feel about me? What is this telling me about what their story is and what they're experiencing in life? So with that being said, let me invite two of the characters in my story, my dear friend Roger and Herb Kagan. And we're going to hear what I said meant to them in their story that they're living in particular life. Gentlemen, good evening.
Hello, Al. Hello.
Hi, Herb.
What do you think?
Hello there, gentlemen. Wonderful.
Hello. You want to kick it off tonight, Herb?
Sure, happy to. The key point that I'm having a reaction to, I'll come to at the conclusion of hopefully maybe 5 or 6 minutes of comment, but I started out as I'm listening to you and knowing we've had lots of conversations about this, and it was captured for me in a distilled way. I am the center of my life. That's the truth. But the lie that I lived was I was the center of life. I was the sun, and everything was a planet around me. I mean, that was not a conscious thing, but it is the way I operated until I began to be conscious, began to wake up through a process of lots of, you've heard me talk of my journey. But the key, and we keep talking about it, don't we? Almost every topic we have, the underbelly, way deep, is consciousness and awareness. Roger made that point when we started really talking about self-esteem, and the centerpiece of that whole approach was about consciousness. And then not to take life personally. Of course I took it personally, everything, when in fact I wasn't a person. I was tied to, in a tethered way, getting my whole sense of meaning and person and value from material outside of me, or even material inside of me, how I thought and felt. I thought it was all real, and it wasn't. It was all a story. And lots more thoughts on it, but I had two insights tonight. Number one is when I begin to perceive my perception like you were describing after the exposure, there's a huge humility that would almost come organically as to the doubt, the initial filter through which I'm looking as, am I seeing the truth or am I seeing the lie? And that's a humility on my part that puts me in that pause because I really don't know, because I know that I've been conditioned and habituated to have a filter that doesn't necessarily tell me the truth. And then the connection I made to some experiences I had in the past in some retreats that other people did was, this man called it the theater of the lie. What you just did, Alan. He actually took 8 people from the group at the retreat center, and he gave them each one of those names that you just talked about: father, mother, brother, partner, and then he had one central character, and he teased them out in terms of having them give a perception of some particular scenario, and it was all like what you just described, very different, but he called it the theater of the lie. And I thought that was like very dramatic. I could never replicate it because I'm not that much of a dramatist, but you reminded me of that. And consciousness on the one hand, which probably develops the humility to pause in the consciousness, knowing that my consciousness is very fallible. So thank you.
So Roger, help me. Did Herb just call me a drama queen? I took that very personally. Jesus.
Well, I hope you did.
Oh no, I made it all about me. Oh God, I love you, Herb. Listen, what you said, I love how you simplified it and said, look, I am the center of my life, of my existence. Of course we are, right? It is the center. And he says, but I am, and what was the second line? I love the second.
I'm not the center of life.
That's it. See, that's the humility that we're looking for. See,
Yeah.
we can't emphasize this strongly enough, is that a big part of emotional sobriety is the ability to attain a state of humility and sustain that state.
Yeah. And the word I use, the phrase I use, it came to me out of all of the work we've been doing previously also. And that is, I try to live undefended.
Yeah.
I really try to live undefended. And if I have any kind of like quiver, my immediate reaction is, what are you defending, Herb? It's really cool.
No, and listen, it helps us because, look at, we're defending some image of ourselves that's threatened.
100%.
That's and we'll be unraveling that stuff more and more as we go on. Well, Raj, what would you like to say about this important topic?
There are lots of ways to come into the issue of understanding it's not personal, as you talk about it in your book. We can come at it from a self-esteem perspective, and how the levels of our self-esteem impact how likely we are to take the behavior of others personally. The higher our level of sense of self-worth and our self-confidence, the less likely we are to be strongly affected by the behavior of others toward us. We can talk about it in terms of one of the 6 pillars of self-esteem, specifically self-acceptance. And again, the same idea: the higher our level, the deeper the level of self-acceptance, the less likely we are to be emotionally reactive to something someone does toward us or says toward us. But I think examples are important. You have a great one in your chapter of the client you were working with, Alan, and his relationship with his wife, and the seeming importance of doing the dishes, the actual importance, symbolically, at least, of her doing the dishes. But the example I want to give of how taking things personally skews our perception. And again, we all do it. That's really the first point I want to make. We are, until we learn not to take it so seriously, even then, I still do it. There's always almost an instantaneous emotional reaction if somebody says something that I think might be a dig at me, or something I perceive as a criticism or whatever. But one of the several things I really liked about this chapter is you talk about, you term it listening to our second voice rather than our first voice. And I'm sure you'll say more about that as we get into it, which is we have our initial reactions. But to me, with a lot of issues, not just taking things personally, but including taking things personally, the major difference between now and 10 years ago and 30 years ago is I'll have that reaction, but much more often than I used to, that my reaction becomes the focus of my attention rather than what the other person said or did.
Yeah.
But I still have the reaction. So I want to remind people of that. We're not talking about some, panacea here where you no longer feel that urge toward defensiveness, to put it in terms you just used. Mm-hmm. Of course I do. Of course we will. But how we respond to that reaction, and that's what takes a lot of time in my experience and a lot of patience. That's what matters most. And as I say, that initial reaction hasn't necessarily changed that much for me over decades. But what has changed, not completely by any means, but quite a bit, is that I no longer feel limited to that initial reaction. And in fact, I'm able to look at it and step back from it. What Alan calls, I listen to my second voice, the voice that can come in as a response to that first reaction. You can also talk about it as reflecting, right? Is another way we talk about it. But the example I wanted to give, it was a couple that Alan and I were working with, probably at least 10 years ago. And I'm going to change up the specifics of it a little bit, but one of the issues they came into to see Alan for, and Alan brought me in for a couple of sessions with them to focus on the emotional dimension of what they were experiencing. But one of the beefs that she had in the relationship is he would withdraw from her a lot. And she really experienced that consistently as meaning he did not love her. This is a real common pattern in relationships. And it seemed almost as if the more she needed him to be there for her at an emotional level, the more withdrawn he would become. And this was immensely hurtful to her. So what Alan had them do is he had them sit on separate couches in his office. And he had the guy do a dialogue between the part of himself that withdraws from her and the rest of him, how he might prefer to be or like to be. And his wife just observed that process. So he started what we call a Gestalt dialogue with this part of him. And the withdrawn part of him shared with the rest of him, and also Alan and I and his wife, what growing up had been like for him, and how intrusive his mother had been in his life, and how the only way he could take care of himself was to withdraw. If he got angry, he was punished for that, or his mom would withdraw from him. So he learned over countless experiences over the years growing up that whenever he wasn't sure what to do, whenever he wasn't sure what version of himself to be, he needed to withdraw. That was the safest path. And he started to cry very deeply about it when he was sitting in that position in the dialogue. And I looked over at his wife, and she was just she was like spellbound and dumbstruck at the same time. It was beginning to dawn on her that this was a lifelong pattern of his that had been in place for him for decades of his life. And it had nothing to do with how much he loved her. And it was really cool to see her begin to grasp that. Then his thing about her was she would get pissed, right? That was his big beef with her. Did the same thing after he'd done his work, and we helped him do some integrative stuff around that with her just witnessing it. Then we moved to her and had her do some work with the angry part of her and the part that takes his behavior so personally. And same thing. As she did this work in dialogue with herself, with the angry part of herself, he began to see that her anger toward him was not about him. This was a pattern of responding that was deeply conditioned in her when she felt insecure, when she felt anxious. She reacted with anger, he would react with withdrawal. They both internalized it and interpreted it as meaning, this means you don't love me. This means you don't care about me. It means you don't accept me. It meant none of those things. Now, did all the problems poof, vanish in a heartbeat? Of course not. Like I say, these patterns of responding are deeply entrenched in us. It takes a lot of attention. It takes a lot of learning how to talk about what we're doing, what we're experiencing.
I remember from that, Raj, I just want to interject at this point. The love that came out of her when she saw him in the pain he was in from the abuse he suffered, and the oppression that occurred in his life. I think you and I were moved to tears, as I remember. We were sitting there. I was overwhelmed with seeing such a pure love come out of her, because we saw her as so angry and so, cold and bitter and hard. And it was an amazing transformation when she let go that this wasn't personal. How she really felt towards him had space to enter her heart and enter her arms and her eyes, and she was crying, and it was it was a peak experience.
It was very powerful. And you're right, we cried right along with her, and it was wonderful for him too, because
never had he felt that love from her. Never.
That's it.
Never had he felt that somebody was so concerned about his feelings, because look at what he experienced, right? They didn't care about what he felt. They cared about whether he was doing the things that they thought he should be doing as a child. And there was no room in his childhood for him to be himself. And so he disappeared. And that's what happens. If we don't feel safe, man, we are going to do something to try to create a sense of safety, even though it's a compromised position, because it can only be what it can be given who we are at that time.
But it's also interesting that they were attracted to one another. Because that was the comfort zone of the habitual reaction.
Exactly.
It's family.
This is family. I recognize this. Right?
That's often a big part. So we say, don't take it personally, and yet we do over and over and over again. It's interesting, the more accepting we become of that pattern, the less power it begins to have over us, which is a general truth that we talk about a lot. But next time we're eager to interpret someone's behavior as meaning they don't care about us, let's be willing to question that assumption. Let's be willing to take a closer look at that and consider the possibility that, wow, this way of responding might have a meaning for them that has nothing at all to do with me and how little or how much they care about me. So
Great point, man. Thank you, Raj. That really was, I'm so glad you brought back in that experience we had, because that was a very powerful 3 days that we spent with them.
yep, yep.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, what a wonderful story. It made me think about cats and dogs, how wagging a tail of a dog means it's happy, but for a cat it's aggravated. Like it has it's nothing personal, but the signals are all wrong in how they see each other. And it was almost like that couple was like doing what they did, and each was interpreting as the exact opposite of what was really going on. Yeah. Really powerful.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.